I was standing at my living room window, watching the first real snowstorm of the season blanket our neighborhood in Lakewood, Colorado, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A man in a bright orange vest was walking along my property line, yanking out every single one of the reflective snow stakes I had carefully placed around my driveway and fence line just 2 days earlier. The stakes were there for a reason. My property sat on a corner lot where the HOA contracted snow removal service always cut too close, and I had learned the hard way that, without clear markers, plow drivers would veer onto my lawn or worse. I threw on my coat and boots, not bothering to lace them properly as I rushed out into the biting November wind. The man had already pulled out about 15 stakes and was tossing them into a pile near the street like they were trash. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, my breath creating white clouds in the freezing air. "Those are my property markers." The man barely glanced at me. He was in his 50s, heavyset, with a scraggly gray beard that had ice crystals forming in it. "HOA violation," he grunted, pulling out another stake with a sharp yank. "Got my orders from Mrs. Patterson. No unauthorized markers allowed on properties visible from the street." Unauthorized. They're reflective stakes to protect my fence from the snow plows. They're temporary and there on my property line. He shrugged, completely unbothered by my distress. "Don't matter to me, buddy. I just do what I'm told. Take it up with the HOA if you got a problem." He pulled out the last stake near my mailbox and added it to the growing pile. I felt my jaw clench. Mrs. Patricia Patterson, the president of our Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, had been a thorn in my side since I moved into this neighborhood 3 years ago. She was the quintessential middle-aged busybody who treated the HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments and her role as president like she was the mayor of a small country. Nothing escaped her notice, and she seemed to take particular pleasure in finding violations where none existed. "Leave those stakes. They're my property and I need them. We're about to get 8 inches of snow according to the forecast, and your plow drivers always hit my fence when there are no markers." The man finally looked at me with something resembling sympathy. "Look, I feel for you, I do. But if I don't follow her orders, she'll have my contract terminated. I got 3 kids and a mortgage. Just call the HOA office tomorrow and sort it out." He walked back to his truck, leaving my stakes in a useless pile on the frozen ground. I stood there in the falling snow, watching him drive away, anger radiating through me. This was beyond petty. This was dangerous and stupid. My fence was a beautiful cedar privacy fence that I had installed myself 2 years ago at a cost of nearly $8,000. It ran along the side of my property that bordered the main road through the neighborhood, and during heavy snows, the plow drivers consistently came within inches of it. Last winter, before I installed the stakes, they had actually clipped one of the posts, causing $200 in damage that the HOA's snow removal company had refused to pay for, claiming I couldn't prove their driver had done it. I gathered up my stakes and brought them inside, snow already accumulating on my coat and in my dark hair. My name is Trevor Morrison, and I'm a software engineer who works from home most days. I had bought this house because it was in a good school district for whenever I had kids, in a quiet neighborhood, and had a large backyard perfect for the dog I planned to adopt. What I hadn't factored into my decision was that the HOA would be run by someone who seemed to have nothing better to do than harass homeowners over the most ridiculous infractions. I had received violation notices for leaving my trash cans visible from the street more than 12 hours after pickup, even though I had been out of town and rushed home as soon as I could. I had received a notice for having a non-approved mailbox, even though my mailbox was identical to 15 other mailboxes on my street. I had received a notice for parking my car on the street overnight when I was having my driveway sealed. The list went on, but this was different. This wasn't about aesthetics or following arbitrary rules. This was about protecting my property from damage that would cost me thousands of dollars to repair. I spent the rest of the evening drafting an email to the HOA board. I kept it professional, explaining the purpose of the stakes, citing the previous damage to my fence, and requesting an exception to whatever rule Patricia thought I was violating. I attached photos of the stakes showing how unobtrusive they were, just thin orange reflective markers that would be completely removed once the snow season ended. I sent it at 8:30 that evening and tried to put it out of my mind. The snow continued to fall heavily throughout the night. By morning, we had received nearly 10 inches, more than the forecast had predicted. The world outside my window was a pristine white landscape, beautiful and treacherous. I made coffee and checked my email, hoping for a response from the HOA. Nothing. Around 9 in the morning, I heard the rumble of heavy machinery. The snow removal crews were making their rounds. I moved to the window and watched as a large truck with a plow attached to the front worked its way down the main road, pushing massive walls of snow to the sides. My stomach tightened with anxiety as the truck approached my corner lot. I pulled on my boots again and headed outside, wanting to be visible and maybe wave the driver away from my fence line if he got too close. The cold hit me immediately, that sharp Colorado cold that seems to find every gap in your clothing. The plow truck was getting closer, its engine roaring as it pushed through the heavy snow. The driver was going faster than I thought was safe, probably trying to finish his route quickly in the brutal conditions. I waved my arms, trying to catch his attention. He saw me and slowed slightly, but as he rounded the corner near my property, I watched in horror as his back end fishtailed in the snow. He overcorrected, and the truck veered sharply to the right, heading straight for my fence line. Without the reflective stakes to guide him, without any clear indication of where the road ended and my property began under all that snow, the driver had no reference point. The sound of splintering would cut through the morning air like a gunshot. The plow struck my cedar fence with tremendous force, demolishing a section about 15 feet long. Fence posts snapped, panels exploded into pieces, and the truck came to a grinding halt with its rear end halfway through what used to be the corner of my fence. I ran toward the accident, my boots slipping in the deep snow. The driver climbed out of his truck, his face pale with shock. He was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, with a look of absolute panic in his eyes. "Oh God, oh man, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I didn't see where the road ended." "Everything's white. I'm so sorry." I took a deep breath, trying to control my anger because I knew this wasn't really his fault. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" He nodded quickly. Yeah, I'm fine. The truck might be damaged though, and your fence, man, your fence is destroyed. I'm so sorry." This is my 3rd week on this route and I don't know it that well yet, and with all this snow, it's okay, I said, even though it very much was not okay. "It's not your fault. Someone pulled out all my property markers yesterday, the ones I put there specifically to prevent this exact situation." He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I need to call my supervisor, and we need to call the police for an accident report since there's property damage." Over the next hour, my quiet residential street became a hub of activity. A Lakewood Police Department officer arrived and took statements from both me and the driver. The driver's supervisor showed up, a gruff man in his 60s, who seemed more concerned about the damage to his truck than my fence. And then, as if summoned by some malevolent force, Patricia Patterson herself appeared. She emerged from her black Cadillac Escalade dressed like she was heading to a business meeting rather than walking through a foot of snow at a property damage site. Patricia was in her early 50s, with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that required weekly salon visits, and she wore a permanent expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. She had that lean, hard look of someone who did intense pilates and survived on salads and white wine. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. She looked at the destroyed fence, the plow truck, and then her eyes landed on me. "Mr. Morrison, what have you done now?" The police officer, a patient-looking woman named Officer Ramirez, turned to Patricia. "And you are Patricia Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. This neighborhood is my responsibility." "This is a traffic accident involving property damage," Officer Ramirez said coolly. "The driver lost control and struck Mr. Morrison's fence. I'm documenting everything now." I stepped forward, my anger finally breaking through. "Mrs. Patterson, yesterday your contractor pulled out all the reflective stakes I had placed along my property line. Those stakes were there specifically to prevent this from happening. The driver had no way to see where my property began because everything is covered in snow." Patricia's face pinched into an even tighter expression. "Those stakes were a violation of our community guidelines. We have standards to maintain." "What standards?" "The standard of having property destroyed because you're too concerned with appearances to allow basic safety measures." My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Mr. Morrison, I don't appreciate your tone. The guidelines are clear. No unauthorized fixtures or decorations visible from the street without prior approval." "They weren't decorations. They were temporary safety markers, and now my fence is destroyed because you had them removed." Officer Ramirez held up a hand. "Okay, let's keep this civil. Mr. Morrison, the accident report will document the condition of the property at the time of the accident, including the absence of any markers or stakes. You mentioned they were removed yesterday." "Yes, by an HOA contractor. A man in an orange vest pulled them all out and left them in a pile. He said Mrs. Patterson ordered him to do it." Patricia's expression didn't change. "I was enforcing community guidelines. Mr. Morrison has a history of violations and seems to think the rules don't apply to him." Officer Ramirez made notes. "The driver stated in his report that visibility was extremely poor and that he had no visual reference for where the road ended. That's consistent with the conditions." She looked at me. "You'll need to exchange insurance information with the snow removal company. This is a property damage issue that will likely be handled through insurance claims." The driver's supervisor, who had been on his phone for most of this conversation, finally spoke up. "Our company insurance will handle it. We've got commercial liability coverage." "I just need your information, Mr. Morrison, and we'll file a claim." Patricia interjected immediately. "The HOA contracts with your company. Any claims should go through the HOA's insurance, not directly to a homeowner." The supervisor shook his head. "That's not how it works, lady. Our driver hit his fence. Our insurance pays for it. Pretty straightforward." I exchanged information with the supervisor while Officer Ramirez finished her report. The whole time, Patricia stood there with her arms crossed, radiating disapproval like it was a superpower. When the police officer left and the tow truck arrived to pull the damaged plow truck away from my property, Patricia approached me again. "This could have been avoided if you had simply followed the rules," she said. I stared at her in disbelief. "You're actually trying to blame me for this?" "Your contractor removed my safety markers. The plow driver couldn't see where to go, and my fence is destroyed. How is this my fault?" If you had submitted a proper request for the stakes, gone through the approval process, this wouldn't have happened. The approval process takes weeks. I submitted a request last winter and never even got a response. It's November. The snow doesn't wait for your approval process. She pulled out her phone and began typing. I'm documenting this interaction. Your aggressive behavior and refusal to take responsibility are noted. Something in me snapped. I had been patient with this woman for 3 years. I had paid every fine, removed every supposed violation, and tried to be a good neighbor despite her constant harassment. But this was too much. Document whatever you want, Mrs. Patterson. But I'm telling you right now, if the insurance company doesn't fully cover the replacement of my fence, I will be seeking compensation from the HOA. You created this situation by removing necessary safety measures from my property. Her eyes narrowed. Are you threatening legal action against the HOA? I'm stating facts. Your actions directly led to this damage. I have emails, photos of the stakes, and now a police report documenting that they were removed and that their absence contributed to the accident. We'll see what the HOA's attorney has to say about your threats. She turned and walked back to her Escalade, her designer boots somehow staying pristine despite the snowy conditions. I went back inside, cold, exhausted, and furious. My beautiful fence was in ruins. There was debris scattered across my snow-covered lawn, and I had just had a confrontation with the neighborhood tyrant. I made more coffee and sat down to photograph everything from multiple angles. I documented the destroyed fence sections, the tire tracks showing where the plow had veered off the road, and the absence of any markers or stakes along my property line. Then I called my insurance company. I explained the situation to a claims representative who listened patiently, and then explained that since the damage was caused by a third party, their insurance should cover it. But I could also file a claim on my homeowner's policy and let the insurance companies sort out subrogation. I decided to wait and see what the snow removal company's insurance would do first. The driver's supervisor called me that afternoon. Hey, Mr. Morrison, this is Dale from Precision Snow Removal. I wanted to update you on the claim. I've reported everything to our insurance carrier, and they'll be reaching out to you within 48 hours to start the claims process. I also wanted to apologize personally. My driver is new to that route, and with the conditions and the lack of markers, he just didn't have enough information to navigate safely. I appreciate the apology, I said. I don't blame your driver. This wouldn't have happened if the HOA hadn't removed my stakes. Yeah, about that. The HOA is trying to claim that we should have been more careful and that it's entirely our fault. They're saying they bear no responsibility. Of course they are, Dale sighed. Look, between you and me, we've had problems with that HOA president before. She's complained about our drivers, threatened to terminate our contract multiple times, and is just generally difficult to work with. Our insurance will cover your fence. Don't worry about that. But I'm also documenting everything about those stakes being removed because if she tries to make this into a bigger issue, I want a paper trail. We ended the call, and I spent the rest of the day trying to do some work, but I couldn't concentrate. Every time I looked out the window, I saw the destruction. Pieces of my fence jutted out of the snow at odd angles, a monument to HOA overreach and bureaucratic stupidity. That evening, I received an email from the HOA. It wasn't from Patricia directly, but from the HOA's management company. The email informed me that I was in violation of multiple community guidelines. First, I had damaged property visible from the street that was creating an eyesore, and I had 24 hours to remove all debris. Second, I had failed to properly maintain my fence, which had led to its structural failure. Third, I was being fined $500 for the violations, with additional daily fines of $100 until the issues were resolved. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise higher. They were actually fining me for having a damaged fence that was damaged because they removed my safety markers. This was beyond petty. This was vindictive. I called my friend Marcus, who was a real estate attorney. We had gone to college together, and he had helped me with the paperwork when I bought the house. I explained the entire situation while he listened without interrupting. When I finished, Marcus let out a low whistle. "Okay, so you've got a few things working in your favor here. First, you have documentation that you placed those stakes for a legitimate safety reason. Second, you have a record of previous damage to your fence from snow plows. Third, you have a police report documenting the accident and noting the absence of markers. And fourth, you now have an email from the HOA that is essentially punishing you for damage that resulted from their actions. So what do I do? First, respond to that email immediately. Keep it professional but clear. State that the damage was caused by a snow plow operated by the HOA's contracted snow removal service, and that it occurred after the HOA removed safety markers from your property. State that you are actively working with the snow removal company's insurance to repair the damage, and that you will not be paying any fines related to damage that the HOA's actions caused. Copy every board member on your response if you can find their emails. What if they don't care? What if they just keep fining me? Then we escalate. But first, let's see how the insurance claim goes. If the snow removal company's insurance pays out and you get your fence fixed, that's the best outcome. The HOA can try to fine you all they want, but they can't put a lien on your house for fines related to damage they caused. If they try, we fight it. I felt slightly better after talking to Marcus. I spent the next hour crafting a response to the HOA's email, using Marcus's suggested language, but adding specific details about the timeline of events. I attached photos of my stakes before they were removed, screenshots of my unanswered request from the previous winter for approval to use safety markers, and the police report number from the accident. I found the email addresses for all 5 board members buried on the HOA's website and copied them all. I hit send and felt a small sense of satisfaction. At least I was fighting back. 2 days later, I received a call from the snow removal company's insurance adjuster. Her name was Linda, and she was incredibly professional and thorough. She asked me to describe the accident, explain the layout of my property, and detail the damage to the fence. She also asked about the removed stakes. So these markers were placed specifically to help plow drivers identify your property line, she asked. Yes. Last winter, before I installed them, the plow service clipped my fence and caused damage. I tried to get compensation but couldn't prove which driver had done it. This year, I put up the stakes early to prevent it from happening again, but the HOA had them removed literally the day before this major snowstorm. And do you have any documentation of that removal? I have the timeline, and I have an email I sent to the HOA the evening they were removed, so that's time-stamped. I also have photos of the stakes in place from when I first installed them. That's very helpful. Can you email all of that to me? I'm going to need to review everything before I can approve the claim, but based on what you're telling me and what our driver reported, it seems pretty clear that this was an accident caused by poor visibility and lack of property markers. Our driver wasn't negligent, but our company is still liable for the damage. How long will the claims process take? Usually about 2 weeks for property damage like this. I'll need to get estimates for the repair cost. Do you have a contractor you'd like to use, or would you like us to arrange for one? I actually built the fence myself with my neighbor's help. It's cedar privacy fencing. Can I get estimates and submit them to you? Absolutely. I'll need at least 2 estimates from licensed contractors, though. Even if you plan to do the work yourself, we need to establish fair market value for the repair. I spent the next few days getting estimates. The damage was extensive. 15 feet of fence was completely destroyed, including 3 posts that would need to be replaced. The estimates came in between $3,000 and $4,500, depending on the contractor and how quickly they could do the work. Meanwhile, the HOA was not backing down. I received another email informing me that my response to their violation notice was unacceptable and that the fines would continue to accrue. They also informed me that I was now in violation of keeping construction materials on my property visible from the street because I had stacked the broken fence pieces near my garage while waiting for the insurance claim to be processed. I forwarded everything to Marcus, who was now getting as angry as I was. "They're just digging themselves deeper," he said. "Every email they send is more evidence of harassment. Keep documenting everything. Don't pay any of these fines, and if they threaten a lien, call me immediately." The insurance adjuster, Linda, was true to her word. Exactly 12 days after my first conversation with her, I received an email informing me that my claim had been approved for $4,200, the average of the 3 estimates I had submitted. A check would be mailed to me within 5 business days. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. At least the fence would be fixed. At least I wouldn't be out thousands of dollars because of Patricia Patterson's vendetta against basic safety measures. But I wasn't done. I had been doing research in my spare time, reading through every page of the HOA's bylaws and community guidelines, and I had found something interesting. According to the bylaws, homeowners had the right to place temporary safety devices on their property during winter months, including but not limited to reflective markers for snow removal purposes. The language was buried in an appendix about seasonal maintenance, but it was there, clear as day. Patricia had violated the HOA's own bylaws by having my stakes removed. I drafted another email, this time to the entire board. I quoted the relevant bylaw, explained that Patricia had violated it, and stated that her violation had directly led to over $4,000 in property damage. I didn't threaten legal action, but I made it clear that I expected the fines to be reversed and that I expected a formal apology from the board. I also did something else. I printed copies of all the documentation, the timeline of events, the photos, the police report, and the emails from the HOA. I created a detailed account of everything that had happened and posted it on our neighborhood's Facebook group. The group had about 300 members, maybe half the households in Meadowbrook Hills. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of comments poured in within the first hour. People shared their own stories of Patricia's overreach. Someone had been fined for leaving Christmas decorations up 2 days past the HOA's deadline, even though they had been out of town for a family emergency. Another person had been threatened with a lien for painting their front door a shade of blue that was supposedly not on the approved color list, even though 3 other houses had the same color. Story after story of petty enforcement and arbitrary rules. Several people specifically mentioned that they had wanted to use snow stakes, but had been afraid of HOA retaliation. One man, a retired engineer named Robert, posted a long comment about how the lack of clear property markers was a safety hazard for the entire neighborhood and that the HOA should be requiring stakes, not prohibiting them. Patricia responded to the Facebook post with a comment that was quickly deleted, but not before several people screenshot it. She had written that I was a troublemaker who refused to follow rules and that the board had every right to enforce community standards. She also threatened to ban HOA-related complaints from the neighborhood Facebook group. That threat backfired spectacularly. People were now even more angry, accusing her of trying to silence legitimate concerns. Someone created a separate Facebook group specifically for Meadowbrook Hills HOA complaints, and within 24 hours, it had over 100 members. The check from the insurance company arrived on a Tuesday. I deposited it immediately and contacted one of the contractors who had given me an estimate. He said he could start work in a week, weather permitting. I also bought new reflective stakes, this time documenting my purchase with receipts and photos. I installed them along my property line, taking extra care to photograph each one from multiple angles with timestamps. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, expecting more fines or threats. Instead, I found a formal notice of a special board meeting to discuss community guidelines enforcement and homeowner concerns. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7, and all homeowners were encouraged to attend. I marked it on my calendar and immediately posted about it in both Facebook groups. If Patricia wanted a public forum to discuss this, I was more than happy to oblige. The week passed slowly. The contractor started work on my fence, and watching it come back together was deeply satisfying. He was fast and professional, and the new section actually looked better than the original because the cedar was fresher and hadn't weathered yet. Thursday evening arrived cold and clear. The meeting was being held at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was usually used for the occasional potluck or book club meeting. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the parking lot already half full. Inside, chairs were set up in rows facing a table where the board members would sit. The room was filling up quickly. I took a seat in the third row and watched as more and more people filed in. I recognized some faces from the neighborhood, people I had waved to while getting my mail or seen at the local grocery store. Many of them gave me nods of support or stopped to quietly tell me they were on my side. Patricia arrived exactly at 7, flanked by the other 4 board members. There was Gerald Thompson, the vice president, a retired accountant who mostly seemed to go along with whatever Patricia wanted. There was Donna Martinez, the secretary, a middle-aged woman who ran a catering business from her home. There was Steve Kim, the treasurer, a quiet man who worked in IT and rarely spoke at meetings. And there was the newest board member, Janet Hughes, who had only been on the board for about 6 months. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. Thank you all for coming. I know there has been some controversy in recent weeks regarding community guidelines enforcement. This meeting is an opportunity for productive dialogue about how we maintain the standards that make Meadowbrook Hills such a desirable place to live. Someone in the back row shouted, "Productive dialogue. You've been fining people for nonsense and ignoring safety concerns." Patricia's face tightened. Please hold all comments until the public comment period. We have an agenda to follow. The agenda included reviewing several proposed changes to the community guidelines, discussing the budget for snow removal services, and then finally, a public comment period. Patricia droned on about various minor policy changes, clearly trying to run out the clock before anyone could speak. But the crowd was having none of it. People started calling out, interrupting her, demanding to get to the public comments. Gerald Thompson leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. She looked annoyed but finally relented. "Fine. We'll move to public comments now. Please keep your remarks brief and respectful." I was the first person to stand. "My name is Trevor Morrison, and I live at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. 3 weeks ago, the HOA had contractors remove reflective safety stakes from my property line. I had placed those stakes to help snow plow drivers identify where my property begins, specifically to prevent damage to my fence. The very next day, during a major snowstorm, an HOA contracted plow driver struck my fence because he couldn't see where the road ended. The damage cost over $4,000 to repair. Patricia tried to interrupt. "Mr. Morrison, those stakes were—" "I'm not finished," I said firmly. I later discovered that according to our own HOA bylaws, homeowners have the right to place temporary safety devices, including reflective markers, on their property during winter months. Mrs. Patterson violated our own rules by having my stakes removed, and that violation directly caused significant property damage. Despite this, the HOA has continued to fine me for having a damaged fence and for storing broken fence pieces on my property while waiting for insurance to cover the repairs. This is harassment and it needs to stop. The room erupted in applause. Patricia looked stunned. Janet Hughes, the newer board member, was flipping through a copy of the bylaws with a confused expression. Robert, the retired engineer, stood next. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 18 years. I've served on the board in the past, and I have never seen such blatant abuse of power as what's been happening under Mrs. Patterson's presidency. The bylaws exist to protect property values and ensure the neighborhood remains pleasant for everyone. They are not meant to be weapons used to harass homeowners who dare to question the board's decisions." More applause. More people stood to share their stories. A woman named Susan talked about being fined for having her garage door open while she unloaded groceries because it was unsightly. A young couple described being threatened with legal action for installing a vegetable garden in their backyard that was visible from their neighbor's second-story window, something not mentioned anywhere in the guidelines. Patricia's face grew redder with each comment. She kept trying to interrupt, to defend her actions, but the crowd wasn't interested in her excuses. Gerald Thompson looked increasingly uncomfortable. Steve Kim was staring at his hands. Donna Martinez was taking notes furiously. But it was Janet Hughes who finally dropped the bomb that changed everything. Janet stood, and the room quieted. She was relatively new to the neighborhood, a lawyer who had moved to Meadowbrook Hills about a year ago. She had run for the board because she wanted to be involved in the community, not realizing what she was getting into. "I need to say something," Janet began, her voice steady but clearly nervous. "I've been on this board for 6 months, and in that time, I've been increasingly concerned about how we've been operating. Mrs. Patterson has been making unilateral decisions without board approval and then presenting them to us as done deals. The decision to remove Mr. Morrison's stakes. That was never voted on by the board. The fines issued to him. Also never voted on. In fact, I've been going through our records and I've found numerous instances of Mrs. Patterson issuing fines and violations without proper board authorization." The room went completely silent. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell over backward. "That is absolutely false. How dare you? I have documentation," Janet said calmly. She pulled out a folder thick with papers. "I've been keeping copies of everything. Unauthorized fines, threats made without board knowledge, contracts signed without board approval. Mrs. Patterson, You've been running this HOA like your personal fiefdom, and it stops now. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership, effective immediately." Gerald Thompson stood, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. I second that motion. The procedural chaos that followed was both fascinating and exhausting. Patricia refused to recognize the motion, claiming it was out of order. Janet countered that according to Robert's Rules of Order, which the HOA bylaws stated should govern all meetings, any board member could call for a vote of no confidence at any time. Gerald and Steve both supported Janet's interpretation. Donna looked torn, but eventually sided with Janet as well. The vote was taken, 4-1. Patricia was removed as president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. She gathered her things in stunned silence, her hands shaking with rage. As she walked out, she turned and pointed at me. "This is your fault. You and your complaints have poisoned this board against me. I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards. You'll all regret this." She left, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. Janet was quickly voted in as the new president. Her first order of business was to move that all fines issued to me be reversed and refunded. The motion passed unanimously. Her second order was to establish a committee to review all HOA guidelines and recommend changes to eliminate overly restrictive or unclear rules. The meeting ended after nearly 3 hours, and I walked out into the cold night air feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Several neighbors stopped me to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Robert invited me to a barbecue he was planning for the spring. Susan asked if I wanted to join the newly formed Guidelines Review Committee. I drove home exhausted but satisfied. My fence was nearly finished. The fines were being reversed. Patricia was no longer in power. It felt like justice, even if it had been a long and frustrating road to get there. The contractor finished my fence 2 days later. It looked perfect, better than before. I installed my reflective stakes along the entire property line, this time without any fear of them being removed. I even added a few extra stakes near the corners where the plow drivers would need the most guidance. But the story wasn't quite over yet. About a week after the board meeting, I received a call from Janet Hughes. "Trevor, we need to meet. Something has come up that you need to know about." We met at a coffee shop near the neighborhood. Janet looked tired and stressed. She ordered a large latte and sat down across from me with a heavy sigh. "I've been going through the HOA's financial records in detail," she said, "and I found some serious irregularities. Money is missing." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean missing?" "The HOA collects annual dues from every homeowner. We should have a reserve fund of around $80,000 for major repairs and emergencies, but the account only has about $32,000 in it." Patricia has been writing checks to herself and to a company called Meadowbrook Property Services. "What's Meadowbrook Property Services?" "That's the thing. I looked it up. It's registered to Patricia's husband. She's been funneling HOA money to a fake company, probably billing for services that were never performed or were wildly overcharged. Trevor, she's embezzled somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 over the past 3 years." I sat back in my chair, stunned. "That's fraud. That's a crime." "I know. I've reported it to the police. They're opening an investigation. I wanted to tell you because you were one of her primary targets, and this might explain why. She was probably trying to deflect attention from her financial crimes by aggressively enforcing petty violations. If everyone was focused on her being a strict rule enforcer, no one would look at the books." The investigation moved quickly. Patricia's husband, a man named Donald Patterson who worked in sales and had always seemed to defer to his wife's domineering personality, initially tried to claim ignorance. but bank records showed deposits from the HOA's account into the Meadowbrook Property Services account, which then transferred money to the Pattersons' personal accounts. Patricia hired a lawyer and tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's former treasurer before Steve had retired and moved out of state 2 years ago, and it became clear that Patricia had taken advantage of the transition period to start her embezzlement scheme. False invoices for landscaping services that were never performed. Inflated bills for snow removal that didn't match what the actual snow removal company charged. Mystery, consulting fees that had no supporting documentation. In early January, Patricia was arrested and charged with embezzlement and wire fraud. The local news covered the story because the amounts involved were substantial, and HOA fraud was apparently a growing problem in suburban communities. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Patricia had let power and greed turn her into a criminal, and now she was facing serious consequences. The HOA held another special meeting to discuss the financial situation. Janet explained everything in detail, and while people were angry about the stolen money, there was also relief that the truth had come out. The HOA's insurance policy covered some of the loss, and the Pattersons were being sued civilly to recover the rest. It would take time, but the HOA would eventually be made whole. In February, Patricia pleaded guilty to the charges as part of a plea deal. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her husband, who cooperated with investigators, received probation and community service. They were also required to pay all legal fees associated with the HOA's civil suit against them. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but it was a different kind of normal. The new board, led by Janet, operated with transparency and common sense. The Guidelines Review Committee recommended eliminating about 40% of the old rules, including most of the petty restrictions that Patricia had loved to enforce. Reflective snow stakes were not only allowed but encouraged. The HOA even purchased stakes in bulk and made them available to any homeowner who wanted them. I ended up joining the board as a regular member. Not an officer position, but someone who could provide input and help prevent future problems. It was more work than I expected, but I felt a responsibility to help make sure what happened to me didn't happen to anyone else. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing the damage it had hidden. But my fence stood strong, the new section blending in with the old as the cedar weathered and aged. My reflective stakes, no longer needed, were carefully stored in my garage for next winter. One warm Saturday in April, I was working in my yard when my neighbor Sarah, who lived 3 houses down, walked over with her golden retriever on a leash. "Hey, Trevor," she said with a smile. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did. I know it was a nightmare for you, but you standing up to Patricia made things better for everyone." I wiped dirt off my hands and petted her dog. "I didn't really have a choice. She destroyed my fence." "Yeah, but a lot of people would have just fixed it and moved on. You could have avoided all the drama. Instead, you fought back, and look what happened. We found out she was stealing from all of us, and now we have a board that actually listens to homeowners." "I guess so. I mostly just wanted my fence fixed and to not get fined for something that wasn't my fault," she laughed. "Well, mission accomplished. Are you coming to the neighborhood barbecue next month? Robert is planning it as a kind of fresh start celebration. Wouldn't miss it." She walked on with her dog, and I went back to my yard work. The afternoon sun was warm, and I could hear kids playing somewhere down the street. It was peaceful. It was normal. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be. A few weeks later, I received a check in the mail from the HOA for $600, the amount of all the fines that had been assessed against me, plus interest. A handwritten note from Janet was included. "Thank you for your courage and persistence. You helped save this neighborhood." I deposited the check and used some of it to buy a really good grill, the kind I had been wanting for years. I figured after everything that had happened, I deserved something nice. The rest went into my savings account, a little financial cushion for whatever unexpected problems might arise. Because owning a home always brings unexpected problems. That's just part of the deal. But what shouldn't be part of the deal is having a hostile HOA president who treats homeowners like subjects to be controlled rather than neighbors to be served. What shouldn't be part of the deal is having reasonable safety measures removed because of petty adherence to aesthetic rules. And what definitely shouldn't be part of the deal is having someone in a position of trust steal from the community they're supposed to protect. As I stood at my grill that evening, cooking burgers for myself and thinking about inviting some neighbors over soon, I looked at my fence. It stood solid and straight, the new section now almost indistinguishable from the original. The reflective stakes were gone, stored away until next winter, but I knew they would be there when I needed them. And more importantly, I knew that if anyone tried to remove them again, there was now a board that would have my back. The legal proceedings against Patricia continued through the summer. Her assets were being liquidated to pay back the HOA. Her house, a large McMansion at the end of a cul-de-sac that she had always seemed so proud of, was sold at auction. She and Donald moved out of the neighborhood, their reputation destroyed, facing years of financial hardship even after she completed her prison sentence. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, not really. It was a waste, a tragic example of how small-time power could corrupt someone so thoroughly. She could have been a good HOA president if she had focused on actually helping the community instead of controlling it. She could have worked with homeowners instead of against them, but she chose a different path, and now she was paying the price. The neighborhood barbecue in May was one of the best community events I had ever attended. Over 100 people showed up, including families I had never met before. Janet gave a short speech about transparency and cooperation, and Robert led everyone in a toast to new beginnings. Kids ran around playing while adults talked and laughed and shared food. It felt like what a community should be. I met a woman named Olivia Zimmerman at that barbecue. She was new to the neighborhood, having just moved in a month earlier. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, funny and easy to talk to, with an infectious laugh that made everyone around her smile. We ended up talking for hours, and by the end of the evening, I had her phone number and plans to get coffee later that week. Life moved forward, as it always does. The fence incident became a story I told at parties, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach that usually got good reactions. The new board continued to function well, making decisions that actually helped the neighborhood rather than restricting it. Property values stayed stable. The snow removal company, perhaps chastened by the accident, was more careful the following winter, and the reflective stakes worked perfectly. I never forgot the lesson, though. I learned that sometimes you have to fight back, even when it's uncomfortable and stressful. I learned that documentation is crucial, that having emails and photos and police reports can make all the difference when you're trying to prove what happened. I learned that communities are strongest when people look out for each other instead of trying to enforce arbitrary rules. And I learned that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you can lead to the best outcomes. If Patricia hadn't pulled out my stakes, my fence wouldn't have been hit. But if my fence hadn't been hit, Patricia's embezzlement might never have been discovered. The neighborhood would have continued suffering under her authoritarian rule, and who knows how much more money she would have stolen. In a weird way, that destroyed fence was the catalyst for positive change. It exposed corruption, brought a community together, and led to real reforms in how the HOA operated. And insurance covered everything, just like it was supposed to. The following winter was mild, with less snow than usual. My reflective stakes stood proud along my property line, orange and bright against the occasional white coating. The plow drivers gave my fence plenty of clearance, and I never had another incident. I would stand at my window during snowstorms, watching them work, and feel grateful that something so simple as reflective markers could prevent so much trouble. Olivia and I kept seeing each other, and by the time spring came around again, she was spending most weekends at my place. We would sit on my back deck, looking at the fence that had started everything, and she would tease me about my famous fence incident. "You know, most people just have furniture or paintings that tell a story," she said one evening as we watched the sunset. "You have an entire fence with a criminal prosecution backstory," I laughed. "When you put it that way, it does sound ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous, it's impressive. You stood up to a bully and exposed a criminal. That takes courage." "I just wanted my fence fixed." "Sure, but you could have just let the insurance handle it and moved on. Instead, you made sure things actually changed. That matters." She was right, I realized. It did matter. Not just for me, but for everyone in Meadowbrook Hills. The neighborhood was better now because people had been willing to stand up and demand better leadership. And it all started with snow stakes and a damaged fence. 2 years after the incident, I was sitting in my living room working on a project when I saw a car pull up to the house across the street. A young family was moving in, and I watched as they unloaded boxes and furniture with the chaotic energy that moving always brings. I remembered my own move into this neighborhood, the hope and excitement of starting fresh in a new place. Later that afternoon, I walked across the street with a welcome basket that Olivia had helped me put together. The new neighbors were grateful and friendly. The husband, whose name was Chris, asked me about the neighborhood. "It's a great place," I told him honestly. "Good people, well-maintained properties, and the HOA is actually reasonable now." "Now?" he asked, picking up on my word choice. I smiled. "There's a story there, but that can wait. The short version is that we had some problems a couple of years ago, but they got sorted out. You'll be fine. Just make sure you read the bylaws and know your rights as a homeowner, and if you ever need help with anything, don't hesitate to ask." He thanked me, and I walked back home feeling good about the neighborhood, about the community we had built and rebuilt after Patricia's reign of terror. The houses looked nice in the evening light, well kept but not oppressively uniform. People were outside walking dogs, pushing strollers, living their lives. It was peaceful and normal and good. That fence, repaired and strong, continued to stand as a reminder of everything that had happened. The cedar had weathered to a beautiful silvery gray, blending perfectly with the original sections. You couldn't tell where the damage had been unless you knew where to look. And maybe that was the perfect metaphor for the neighborhood itself. The damage had been real and significant, but with effort and care, it had been repaired. The scars were there if you looked closely, but they didn't define us. I had learned so much from that experience. I had learned about HOA law, about insurance claims, about community organizing and standing up for what's right. But more than that, I had learned about the importance of documentation, persistence, and not backing down when you know you're right. Patricia had counted on me being just another homeowner who would grumble but ultimately comply. She had miscalculated badly. The reflective stakes remained a symbol of that fight. Every winter when I placed them along my property line, I thought about what they represented. They were practical, yes, preventing damage to my fence from snow plows. But they were also a statement that homeowners had rights, that safety mattered more than aesthetics, and that arbitrary rules could be challenged and changed. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle and life in Meadowbrook Hills settled into a comfortable rhythm, I sometimes wondered what Patricia thought about in her prison cell. Did she regret her actions? Did she understand how her need for control and her criminal behavior had ultimately destroyed everything she claimed to be protecting? I would never know, and ultimately it didn't matter. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. The neighborhood thrived under Janet's leadership. The HOA reserve fund was rebuilt, the guidelines were fair and reasonable, and homeowners actually felt like the board was working for them rather than against them. It was everything an HOA should be, and it had taken a crisis to get there. My fence stood strong through another winter, then another spring. The property values in Meadowbrook Hills actually increased as word spread that we had a functional HOA that didn't harass homeowners. People wanted to live somewhere with reasonable rules and competent leadership. It was a small piece of evidence that doing the right thing could actually work out, and every time it snowed, every time I saw those reflective stakes marking my property line, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. They were just stakes, just simple plastic markers, but they had changed everything. They had exposed corruption, brought justice, and helped create a better community. Insurance had covered the fence, justice had covered Patricia's crimes, and life had moved forward in the best possible way. That's the thing about standing up for yourself. You never know where it might lead. Sometimes you just want your fence fixed, and you end up reforming an entire HOA, exposing embezzlement, and helping dozens of neighbors who were suffering under the same oppressive rule. Sometimes doing the right thing has ripple effects that go far beyond what you initially intended. As I write this now, looking out my window at that fence, at those stakes standing ready for the next snow, I feel grateful for the whole experience. It was stressful and frustrating and sometimes felt overwhelming. But it taught me that I was capable of more than I thought, that communities could change for the better, and that sometimes the simplest things like reflective snow stakes could become the catalyst for major positive change. The fence is just a fence. The stakes are just stakes. But together, they tell a story about justice, perseverance, and the importance of standing up to bullies, whether they're in a schoolyard or running your homeowners association. And that's a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth learning from. My neighborhood is better now because people were willing to fight for it. My fence is repaired because insurance worked the way it should. And Patricia is in prison because the justice system, for once, actually held someone accountable for their crimes. It's not a perfect ending, because real life rarely provides those. But it's a good ending, a just ending, and one that I can live with. As the sun sets on another day in Meadowbrook Hills, I raise a glass to reflective stakes, to good insurance adjusters, to brave board members who stand up for what's right, and to the simple truth that sometimes when life knocks down your fence, you get the opportunity to build something better in its place.